Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel. I'm so delighted you've joined me this evening, wherever you are in the world. And I just want to send my love to each and every one of you, and I truly hope you're doing very, very well. Tonight's story may be a little gory if you're not into that kind of thing. If you haven't subscribed to my channel, please do so. It really means a lot to me. Click the notification bell and the thumbs up. And let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Marcus, and when I was born on October the 5th, 1966, my life began with a veil of mystery shrouding it, of which the answers have never been found, leaving me with unanswered questions over my family heritage that I may never be able to resolve. But all these years later, I've come to terms with all that. My strange, mysterious birth is more aligned with the world of fiction novels rather than those of fact, but I assure you that my story is true. I was found lying in a little basket in the pew of a local church with a tiny note pinned to my baby blanket saying, "To whom this may concern, I'm an Irish Catholic immigrant. If my parents knew about my baby, I would be in heaps and heaps of trouble, and they would automatically disown me. I love my baby, but I cannot keep him. Please take very good care of him for me, and make sure that he has a great life. His name is Marcus. Yours very gratefully, Anonymous. P.S. Please let my baby know that he was always loved, and none of this was ever his fault." I gather there were newspaper articles written about me requesting that my frightened mother of the mystery note to come forward to claim her baby, but she never ever did. I was to learn that in those days, especially if you grew up in a very strict religious home, having a baby out of wedlock was highly frowned upon. Today it's so much more acceptable, but back then it was very difficult for many young women. I never held any bitterness towards my mother for literally giving me up. I'm almost certain that she was a young teenager at the time who hid her pregnancy under layers of loose-fitting clothing from her parents, and possibly gave birth to me in a confined space while her parents may have been fast asleep. I cannot imagine what that poor girl went through, having me without any medical supervision, and then having to give me up by whisking me off to the local church and leaving me there lying in a basket on a pew. It must have been the hardest thing that she ever had to do in her young life. I cannot imagine what she went through, not only days after my birth, but months and years later. My only hope is that was not ravaged by guilt, or ended up having a full life and children of her own. Who knows, I may actually have some brothers and sisters out there. I sincerely hope I do. I initially started my early life in an orphanage, and then I was taken from one foster home to another. When I was 8, I ended up in a foster home in Kentucky with 2 parents who I believe only fostered me because of the state benefits they attained for my care. Truly, they did not take care of me out of the goodness of their heart or because they loved children. On the contrary, they would have preferred not to have had me around at all. But I did have my uses, which they took great advantage of, like mucking out the stables and feeding the pigs and the chickens. They were not terrible people in any way, but they most certainly treated me differently to their natural children, like getting me to do all the dirty jobs around the farm and giving me second-hand clothing and cast-offs. At Christmas, I was the one that got far inferior gifts to the other kids. One Christmas I got a pair of socks, for example, and my brother got a train set, while my foster sister got the doll she'd always wanted. When there were kiddies' birthday parties, for example, my foster parents went out on a limb for their real kids, insisting on giving them the most fantastic parties. But when it was my birthday, I was very lucky if my mother even made me a cake. As you can imagine, there were times I felt very left out and excluded, but I did understand that not being related by blood meant that I would never ever be fully accepted, and I did come to terms with that. I was definitely the black sheep of the family, and I knew I was there for monetary gain rather than to be loved or wanted. I did find my own solace and peace growing up, as I diverted my attention away from the politics of the inner family circle, and I focused my attention on the natural world. I adored animals, especially dogs, because they love so unconditionally. They never judge you, and they accept you just as you are, without expecting you to conform to worldly ideals. I also loved the horses, and I adored the pigs and even the chickens on our farm. I had a passion for all the animals. And one time when my father was going to kill one of the pigs for a pot roast, I know it's hypocritical of me because I love pork, but I loved that pig a whole lot more. I took that creature to the woods and I literally set him free, and I think he knew what I was doing. I do not know what actually became of him because he never came back to our farm and seemed delighted to be free. My father believed that someone had actually stolen the pig, but there were reports of a huge massive pig seen rummaging in the forests in Kentucky many months later, so I hope he had a great life and was never turned into bacon, but I guess I'll never really know. My brother Paul sensed his parents were not inclusive with me growing up, so he became prejudiced towards me. Although we did sometimes play together, he grew extremely distant towards me, and we never became close. My sister Amelia was very sweet, but she wasn't interested in anything that involved rough and tumble, but liked to read books and play snakes and ladders, and genuinely preferred to remain indoors most of the time. My foster parents lived in a shabby farmhouse with stables and pretty run-down outbuildings that were all in a dilapidated state and needing money spending on them to fix up the place, which my parents never had. The farmhouse was always in a mess and could have done with some TLC, but they rarely weren't interested in all that stuff. And to be honest with you, neither was I. I loved the great outdoors, and every ounce of my spare time, apart from my homework and doing household chores, was spent in the woods that flanked all the neighbouring farms and stretched back for miles and miles to eternity. They were so incredibly beautiful, and always a place of mysterious intrigue, and where I would spend so many times in soulful reflection, which I did a lot as a young boy. I had a favourite spot in the woods where there was a huge open clearing and a gloriously large creek, where I simply loved to watch the white-tailed deer coming to the water to drink. I always loved their gentle, serene natures, and I never ever got tired of watching them. They eventually got so used to me just sitting there eyeing them and watching them all the time that after a while I became like a fixture and fitting in the woods that they no longer were afraid of. One day as I entered the woods, I sensed that something was really off. I don't know how to describe it to you, but I really felt that something was incredibly wrong. It was like the woods had taken on a menacing ambience, and all that cheerful, pretty birdsong in the valley had all receded, and all signs of life had vanished. I kid you not, I did not see a bird on a branch tweeting, nor did I see a squirrel nibbling acorns, or a rabbit diving into its burrow. Everything was deathly quiet and airily still, and the only thing I could hear was my breath before my face. In all my previous visits to the wood, they had never ever felt like this before. It was like I sensed a very ominous presence of evil. That's the only way I can explain it. I decided to leave the forest immediately. I wanted to listen to my gut, but very suddenly I was distracted by this hefty movement in the brush that got my attention. It sounded like something monstrously big was moving around in the heavy, overgrown thicket. And whatever it was, this thing was huge. It sounded like a rhino or an elephant because when it moved, the ground thumped and vibrated under its monstrous weight. I think in that moment I was more curious than frightened because I was eager to find out what this thing could be. So I immediately took cover. I hid behind the trunk of the very old oak tree to see what would happen next. I heard the creature thundering through the high grass and bolting through it like a speed train on full throttle until he came to the open clearing which was very near to where I was hiding. I could see this creature so clearly, and nothing prepared me for what I was actually seeing. It was a monstrous giant-like creature standing on two legs with a distinctly humanoid stature. He was covered from head to toe with long, silvery, straggly hair, and there was a look about him that reminded me of a silverback gorilla. He was, of course, infinitely bigger and was easily 8 feet tall and 800 pounds and approximately 5 feet wide. His head was shaped like a bullet with a very prominent and distinct brow ridge, large, deep-set yellow-brown eyes, a flat nose, and a very slender mouth. I noticed the creature kept looking over his shoulders as if he was expecting something or someone to appear through the brush. This surprised me because I didn't think it was even remotely conceivable that such a powerful creature with such an impressive, formidable proportion of dense muscle and superhuman strength could be in the slightest bit intimidated by any other living creature. I could see that this animal was without doubt an apex predator, without a single living foe. Of that I was certain. I watched the creature quickly straddle the tree trunk as if he was in a dreadful hurry. He prized his muscular thighs on the sides of the trunk and shimmied up its great girth with effortless ease, like a fireman sliding up a long pole. I watched him reach out with a hairy humanoid hand to grab a tree branch, and he twisted his body forwards, pulling himself up into the higher branches of the tree with the fluidness and dexterity of a gymnast. Suddenly I heard the voices of two men walking through the brush. One of them I recognized instantly as belonging to the neighborhood farmer, who was a man we kids liked to call Farmer Bruce. I knew that he frequented these woods regularly for hunting practices. "It's usually a good spot to hunt here," I heard his familiar voice saying. "But today, for some reason, it's deathly quiet. Normally this place is teeming with wildlife. There are some prime specimen of whitetail around here." "I don't like the feel of this place," came the other voice. "It feels a little creepy to me." "It's not normally like this, I promise you," came Bruce's reassuring voice. "We could build a deer stand around here," he continued. "This would be a good spot because the creek is on the left-hand side, and the deer tend to approach it on this side." "I'm not sure about this," said the other man. "I'm just not comfortable about the place. It feels like something is watching us." The two men were now literally standing under the very tree where the hairy humanoid was hiding, and I imagine his predatory eyes were pinned directly on them. I literally stood behind the oak tree, only yards away, not daring to move. I was absolutely terrified that even the sound of my fast breathing could be heard by this creature. I wish I had possessed the courage to call out to the men to warn them about the creature that was lurking in the tree. But I was so incapacitated by fear, and my only thoughts were to stay as quiet as I possibly could, with the hope that I would finally get out of the woods alive. I'm afraid to admit it, I was in survival mode, thinking only about saving my own skin. Suddenly the creature let out the most terrifying growl, and it was unlike anything I have ever heard. "Ah! Ah!" It was such a dreadful sound that it caused the whole ground to vibrate, and the men almost lost their balance for a moment as the ground quaked. The two men looked utterly terrified. I noticed Farmer Bruce was wobbling violently and clutching his rifle, looking through the undergrowth to see if he could detect something with his beady eyes, but he saw nothing. "What the hell was that?" he cried out in horror. "I told you something isn't right about this place," said the other man. "Let's get out of here right now." Suddenly the monstrous creature jumped out of the tree, landing yards away from the terrified men, with the agility of a domestic cat, but with such a heavy thud that everything vibrated, like the shock waves you get from a mild earthquake. It was just like that. The two men screamed in terror. No, no! Farmer Bruce stumbled and fell a few times, looking back at the creature like a hunted animal, and running backwards from it as fast as he possibly could, tearing through the undergrowth at a very impressive speed. The other man seemed unable to move, because he was shaking so very much, and I believe he was utterly frozen. He seemed incapacitated by fear. I have seen this behaviour a lot in animals when they're being attacked by a predator, especially with the feral cats on our farm, when they started to pursue a mouse. Sometimes the poor mouse was so frozen in terror, it became an easy target for the cat. Farmer Bruce's friend just stood there, paralysed, unable to move. His Arctic blue eyes became as round and as wide as saucers, and his jaw hung to the ground with a look of horror written over his pale face that had drained almost completely of colour. The creature lunged towards him, whirled his lanky body in the air like it was a Catherine wheel. He went whizzing around and around and around, and then falling over a snapped tree branch, and he became impaled by the thing like a large piece of skewered beef being pierced through a sharp pole. The face of the man became frozen in fear, with wide, terrified eyes and an open mouth that lay fixed in position, accounting the horrified last minutes of this poor man's life. He was definitely deceased, and the blood was pouring from the branch and trickling onto the ground, where it congealed into a thick, bloody gel. Looking at this poor man dying in this way was positively the most horrific thing that I have ever seen in my entire life. I could hardly believe what I was actually seeing. The creature was chattering to itself excitedly, as if he'd really enjoyed the adrenaline rush of killing this man in such a horrifying way. And he licked some of the man's dripping blood off his sausage-sized finger and tasted it. Then what he did next was the most repulsive, shocking thing that I've ever witnessed in my entire life. I literally watched this creature gouge out the man's eyes from its sockets with his thick fingers and pop them into his mouth like they were delicious sweets. He smacked his lips afterwards as if he'd really relished the taste of them. I knew that in some parts of the world they do eat sheep eyeballs, which are considered a treat, but seeing this sent shivers down my spine, and the corpse of the man just looked even more terrifying, with two wide gaping sockets just staring blankly into space from the tree branch. It was like something out of the most vile horror movie. I was the one now, behind the tree, shaking in fear, and too frozen to the spot to even flinch or move a muscle. I could feel my heart pounding through my chest, and I was so terrified that it was loud enough that the predator could actually hear it. There is no way I know of how to still the sound of a heavy, loud, violent heartbeat. The creature slapped the face of the dead corpse as if it was a plaything, and then he seemed to lose interest pretty fast, and I watched him glide away on his long, hairy, muscular legs, and he moved with such agility and grace, and was gone from my sight so fast, but my relief was short-lived. Suddenly I heard the sounds of men's voices, slamming car doors, rifles firing off warning sounds, and then I saw the police. They were creeping in the woods with their rifles at the ready, and there were lots of them. I could hear them talking to Farmer Bruce. "It happened around here," he said, pointing to the spot where his friend now lay impaled by the tree trunk. I could hear the audible gasps as the policeman and Farmer Bruce just stared in shocked horror at the dead body of his friend that was impaled by the tree, and they gasped when they saw the hollowed-out sockets for the eyes. "What the heck?" said the police officer. "How in God's name did this happen?" I could hear Farmer Bruce's voice wobbling uneasily. "Maybe he tried to climb the tree to escape the creature, and he fell." "What kind of creature did you say it was that you saw?" "I didn't get to see it closely," I heard Farmer Bruce lie. It all happened so fast. I think it was a black bear. I could see this black shadowy form, and I just ran away. But how did this poor man lose his eyes like this? I hardly think this is the work of a black bear. They don't behave like this in a human attack. Could it not just be a vulture of some kind? Said Farmer Bruce, offering a feeble explanation for the missing eyeball. You'll have to come back with us to the station, sir, to file out a report. In the meantime, I'll get the coroner to examine the body before we move it. I want to tell you that I crept out of the woods as quietly and as silently as I could, taking the back way. I was so shocked by what I had seen that I found myself in a state of shock for a very long time afterwards. Even my foster family commented on how unusually quiet and withdrawn I had become over recent days, and they usually took such little interest in my comings and goings, so for them to notice my subdued demeanour was very impressive, to say the least. One night over dinner, my foster father was discussing Farmer Bruce's strange encounter. He reckons it was a black bear that chased him, said my father. I'm not sure about that. In my experience, you do not run from a bear, and that's exactly what he did. His friend got impaled on a tree branch while escaping the creature, and he fell onto it. It was a terrible, tragic accident. But get this, his friend's eyeballs were gouged out. Now that's not a bear. I agree, said my foster mother. That doesn't sound like a bear attack to me. Have you seen anything strange in the woods, Marcus? Asked my foster father suddenly. I know you go there a lot. No, I lied, flushing a bright red colour. I've not seen anything. Can I have more of that cauliflower, please? I said, trying to change the subject quickly. I thought you hated cauliflower, said my foster mother, passing me a bowl of the congealed muck. Oh, no, I love it, I said, piling my plate with heaps of the No, I love it, I said, piling my plate with a heap of disintegrated mush and stuffing large amounts of it into my mouth to avoid being cross-examined by my parents, who were both looking at me curiously. Now, Marcus, snapped my foster mother. Try not to put too much food into your mouth at once. It's not a pretty sight for the rest of us to see. You must be very careful in those woods, Marcus, said my father. I know we let you run wild around the place, but there are things in those woods that cannot be explained. Believe me, I know. I grew up here in Kentucky, and I've seen things myself that defy explanation, let me tell you that. Tell them about the time you saw the wolf man, dear, said my mother, nagging her husband. Go on, dear. It's time our kids know the real dangers that lie out there. I nearly spat the cauliflower all over the table in shock. You saw a wolf man? I asked, my eyes growing as round as saucers. I did, said my foster father. As he recounted his experience to the rest of us, he physically started to shake. I realised in horror that my foster father had also had a strange encounter once that had truly ruffled his feathers, so much so that the mere memory of the event was actually giving him the jitters, and for the first time in my life, I actually felt sympathy towards him. I knew personally from my own gut-wrenching experience how harrowing his encounter must have been. Go on, tell them, urged my foster mother again. Our kids need to hear the truth. What happened? Asked my foster brother eagerly. Tell us, Dad, please. Well, it was in 1962, when I was coming home from a party. A friend of mine had invited over 100 people to an amazing barbecue, and it was a long, drawn-out affair, but we all had a very good time. I had a girlfriend at the time, Angie, I think her name was. She was a pretty little thing, really. But she didn't hold a candle to your mother, of course, he said, reaching out to touch my stepmother's hand. I remember looking at my stepmother and secretly thinking that the entire female population was infinitely more attractive than she was. Anyway, he continued, we went into the woods to get away from the rest of the crowd. I had a flashlight with me, and I liked the idea of spending some lone time with Angie. I bet you did, teased my foster mother. Your father was always a player. He always had an eye for the ladies. Whereabouts was this? Asked my brother. A few miles from here, son, he said. Angie was a giggler, he continued. She just could not stop giggling when we entered the woods. And she started talking all about ghosts and all kinds of scary things. It was because when we entered the woods it was really very creepy. I can't explain it to you, but we thought someone was actually watching us. And I will tell you this, the whole place gave me the heebie-jeebies. It was very unsettling. Then we saw it. Saw what? Asked my brother. The wolf man, of course, snapped my father. Stop interrupting me, son. I'm trying to tell you the story. It was standing there on a branch of a tree, looking down on us with these evil glowing red eyes. And this thing was monstrously huge. He was about 7 feet tall and 500 pounds, and he had the face of a wolf, but he was standing upright on 2 legs like a human. He was covered with thick grey hair, and his mouth was oversized for his face, and when he growled, all you could see was those sharp, white, dagger-like teeth. When he growled, the noise was so piercing it went right through you. The creature started to break pieces of the branch off the tree, and he threw them at us. Oh, and we hightailed it out of the woods as fast as we could, I can tell you. It was the most terrifying thing that I've ever seen in my entire life. Do you know what? Angie refused to see me after that. That was the end of our relationship. Do you think that is what Farmer Bruce saw? Asked my brother suddenly. I'm certain of it, said my father. He's definitely lying about what he saw in the woods. The creature that I saw fits the profile exactly. It would have happily gouged out that person's eyes. I'm sure it was the wolf man that was responsible for the attack. And you know what? Farmer Bruce is not telling anyone about it. He's worried about what people will think. Yes, said my brother. But why did the wolfman not run off with the body to eat it? Surely he would have devoured everything. Maybe he wasn't hungry, said my father. Or he could have heard the police entering the woods and panicked and run off. I sat listening to them all pontificating about the mystery creature that had attacked the farmer's friend. Little did they know I was sitting on all the answers, and they were veering way off course, because the creature responsible for the attack was indeed a humanoid ape, and most certainly not a wolfman. I was determined to never tell anyone what I had seen, not only because they would have been unlikely to believe me, but because I felt ashamed that I had not warned those men about that nasty creature in the tree. For a long time I did not visit the woods after my encounter, but I began to miss it so much that I finally overcame my fear. But I always took my stepfather's rifle with me, and I learnt to leave the forest well alone if things became strangely quiet. One evening when my foster sister Amelia, who was 18 years old, one time went for an evening stroll with her new boyfriend in the woods, they both returned home deathly pale, swearing that they'd both seen a ghost in the woods, with huge hollows for eyes, wearing a blue plaid shirt. He just disappeared in front of our eyes, said Amelia. What did he look like? I asked. He was thin and lanky, with white hair, hollows for the eyes, and wearing tan pants and the blue plaid shirt. And get this, he had a huge bleeding hole in his stomach area. It was definitely a ghost, said her boyfriend Kirk. It looked at us and vanished before us. I think you're describing Farmer Bruce's friend, I said to Amelia. Remember the man that got impaled by the tree branch and died? Oh, yes, said Amelia. I remember the story. It must be him. Maybe he does not know he's dead, and he's wandering around the woods. After my sister's sighting of the impaled ghost in our area, there were many other people who claimed to have seen his ghost. So many paranormal investigators over the years definitely frequented the area and claimed to have recordings of his voice and EVPs. Anyway, so that is my story. But I will say this to you. I never remained close to my family. I never remained close to my family once I left home, and we never remained in touch, and I've never ever missed them. Over the years, I did get married and have kids of my own, and I adopted a foster child and gave him everything I never had growing up. And I love him as much as all my natural children, and give him everything that I give them. I also want to say that I discovered the creature that I saw in the woods all those years ago was indeed a Sasquatch or a Bigfoot. But only then my wife and family knew about my encounter. But now you do too. And I hope you enjoyed my story. Well, I certainly loved your story. What an incredible story. Can you imagine, this poor man being impaled by this tree trunk and dying in such frightening circumstances? It must have been a very terrifying ordeal for a young boy to have to watch something like that. That was quite some story. And to think also that your foster father actually saw a wolf man. I thought that was a dog man. I didn't know you got a wolf man, but maybe you do. And what an interesting story too. That was fascinating. Thank you for sharing that with us. Until next time, goodbye and good night.